True.
Good morning, everybody. Boker Tov, Lekulam, too near and too far, our friends in Carmiel and our friends in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. I am Rabbi Mark Asher Goodman, soon to be Associate Rabbi at Congregation Beth Shalom in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We are doing Talmud, and we are rounding out the very, very end of Tractate Rosh Hashanah, which it should still take a little bit of time, but we're having a really good time dealing with the question of what are the verses that are said in Rosh Hashanah in the Musaf for Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, right? Which is the additional big chunky chunks at the end of the kind of prayers of Musaf, most of which are kind of perfunctory and traditional in the sense that they mirror the ideas that show up in Amidah for the rest of the year, right? Like Kedushat Hayom, the special like kind of blessing for the day, like basically a rabbinic exhortation. Why are we saying this thing on this holiday? But then we get into these three chunks, and the rabbis have determined for us in previous weeks, for those of you who have missed a class or two or have memory problems like I do, that perhaps you have to say 10 verses from the Tanakh for each of these sections. Malchuyot, which translates as kingship, Zichronot, which translates as remembrances, and Shofarot, which translates as shofars. And so we just turned at the very end of the last page before we flipped over to the question of what verses are appropriate, which is a really cool idea, because what we're implying here is that any congregation can choose any 10 verses throughout the Tanakh that they like that are about remembrance, any 10 verses about God's kingship, any 10 verses about shofar. Aha! But the rabbis say you can't do anything you want. And so the last thing we talked about is verses of Purianot, right? Verses that and a good word that I saw, I don't remember if this is a translation that I just picked up or whether I'm suddenly remembering, any verses of calamity, right? It's a Scrabble bonanza today, right? Any verses that deal with calamity of the Jewish people should not be mentioned, because, and I think this is really one of those things we were talking about last class. Talmud is sort of psychoaffective to God, right? But even if it's not psychoaffective to God, it's psychoaffective to us. And so invoking verses in the Torah that imply, oh, we're such naughty children, we've all I keep slapping myself today. We've been so evil and we should be punished. Let us mention verses in which God shall punish us is not appropriate, right? We should not invoke and call down upon ourselves punishment. We should invoke God's majesty without talking about God's punishment. So that's a theme we're going to continue with. And then we're going to continue kind of thinking about what are other ways in which verses might or might not be appropriate. And the rabbis are going to have a good old-fashioned fight about what is theologically appropriate. And again, to a thing we said last class, this is an interesting departure because the rabbis in the Talmud are practicing theology, which is typically not a thing they do. And they're asking, because at the end of the day, when we ask what lines in prayer should we say that should move the unmoved mover, that should move the divine, we're really asking, right? Like, what does God believe fundamentally about us? How does God act in the world towards Jews, towards non-Jews? Why does God act in the world the way God acts? So for those of you who like theology, this is your jam. Like this is a very good section of Talmud for you. If you don't like theology and you would like us to get back to the intricate intellectual battle of logic, the branched versus Aristotelian logic that we experience in a typical section of Talmud, hold on for a page and a half and we'll get there. Okay, with that, they will eventually get there. The rabbis will always come back to it. So we're actually picking up with I think the last line that we left off with, but we're not going to spend any time with it. Noreen, will you read this for us in the English?
I will.
Great. Zikaron, Kigon, Vayizkor ki vasar hema v'gomre. Shofar kigon tiku shofar begiva v'gomre.
Similarly, verses of remembrance that speak of a punishment may not be used in Rosh Hashanah prayers. For example, so he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes away and does not come again. Nor verses of shofar, which refer to calamity. For example, sound the shofar in Givah and the trumpet in Ramah. Sound an alarm at Beit Haven behind you, O Benjamin.
Good. We had a bit of a disagreement, and Olivia was kind of the main engine of the disagreement about the first verse, Psalm 78, and whether that was really calamitous enough to be excluded. But the rabbi said it's to be excluded, and so it's excluded. I mean, like that's kind of ultimately where we end up with that. And the reason is that it really talks about mortality, and it's not necessarily that calamitous. But it was, and I think Olivia objected, and I mostly agree with Olivia. I think she had a really good point there. The second section, sound the shofar in Givah and a trumpet in Ramah, is more easy to understand in context. And we mentioned it last time that we were talking about an army arriving behind the lines of the Israelites and making war upon them. And sweeping them away. That is calamity, right? So when we talk about the shofar in that verse, it's not a good mention of shofar. And therefore the rabbis are like, you should not bring up this kind of usage of shofar. There's plenty of good verses about shofar. There's plenty good verses about zicharon, right? Because in that second verse, the key word there is vayizkor, and God remembered. So when you invoke it, pick a good line. All right. That's our full review from last time, and now we're going to pivot and start to argue. Marion, you are up, if it's okay by you. Aval im balomar malchut zichron v'shofar shel puranot shel nochrim omer. Malchut kigon Adonai malach yirgezu amim ukegaon Adonai melech olam va'ed avdu goyim me'artzo zikaron kigon Zachor Adonai livnei Edom v'gomre. Shofar kigon, v'Adonai Elohim b'shofar yitka v'halach b'sa'arot teman, uktiv Adonai tzvaot yagein alehem.
The Gemara qualifies the Mishnah's ruling. However, if one comes to recite verses of kingship, remembrance, and shofar, with the theme of the punishment of Gentiles, one may recite them. The Gemara offers examples of these verses. With regard to the verses of kingship, for example, the Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. And for example, the Lord is king forever and ever. The nations are perished out of his land. With regard to remembrance, for example, remember, O Lord, against the children of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. With regard to the verses of shofar, for example, and the Lord God will sound the shofar and will go with whirlwinds of the south. And it is written, the Lord of hosts will defend them. That is, God will defend the Jewish people against their enemies.
Great. Okay, so again, this is why we're doing theology a little bit. The Talmud says calamity is, or punishment, or disaster, depending on how you want to translate the word puranot, is not to be said regarding the Jews. However, it is permitted regarding the Gentiles. So we'll stop and just pause and say two things about this. And then if anybody has thoughts, I would love, this would be a great moment to kind of throw in. Thought one is just an academic point, which I don't do a lot, by the way. I don't pretend to have gotten a PhD in Talmud. Rabbis are generalists, right? We're ER docs. We handle what comes through the door overwhelmingly, unless we get a specialty in something. I have a specialty, I think, in two things. One I haven't studied in so long, I'm not sure I can call it a specialty anymore, which is workers' rights and workers' justice in Jewish texts. And the second thing is I'm like the only conservative rabbi, that I know who spends all his time studying Chassidut. So those are my jams. But that being said, I do know enough Talmud from an academic perspective to be able to say this authoritatively. In line 3, where it says, Aval im balomar malchut zichron v'shofar shel puranot shel nochrim, it's notable that the word nochrim appears in the Hebrew. Why? Because in the medieval period, there was censorship of the manuscripts of the Talmud. And when manuscripts were written, right, remember before the printing press, everything had to have been handwritten. So the first real like printed editions of the Talmud, I think, don't really emerge until the 15 and 1600s. It's really uncommon. So everything was handwritten. So from the like basically 11th century to the 15th century, if you wanted a copy of the Talmud, you had to pay someone a really large amount of money to handwrite it. And because that was, basically public, you knew who the local scribe was, and the church knew who the local scribe was, they could go and look over their shoulders. And if there were any apostate Jews, and there were at the time, who were literate, they could go through and read and say, no, this is a polemic against Christians. This is a polemic against non-Jews. This is not okay. It needs to be edited. Because the Talmud, the Talmud that we have, the Talmud Bavli that we are reading from right now is, as far as I know, it's the cobbling together of multiple extant manuscripts. There are, as far as I know, something like 9 mostly complete or half complete manuscripts. And the text that we are based off of is, I think, the cobbling together of 3 effectively. But there were different editions where the word nochri would have probably been excised. And I was checking to see in the notes here if it had been, because often the word nochri was substituted with the word ovdei kochavim. And oved kochav is literally translates as like star worshipers, but it might be more literally understood as idol worshipers, right? Effectively. The Christians were okay with Jews writing polemics against idol worshipers because they did not believe themselves to be in that category. So what would happen was the Christian censors would go through and they'd scratch out the word nochri and say that you can't use that. And the Jews would write in the word oved kochavim. Sometimes they would just write the acronym akum, right? And they would look at the censors and go, is that all right? And they would go, yeah, we're fine with that. If you're going to give a polemic against animists and, people who put up like altars, that's fine. And then the Jews would go and teach this text to each other. And they say, when the Ovdei Kochavim say this, it's okay. And then in parentheses, the rabbi would turn to his class and say, we're talking about the Christians, right? And then they would move on, right? That's how it was done. So that's just a notable thing that I just wanted to call to our attention, kind of like the word nochrim shows up. Now, that I think is actually valuable information for understanding this section of Talmud a little bit in context, right? To say in our prayers, we wish ill upon non-Jews as part of our Rosh Hashanah liturgy feels to me, as a person who literally just went to an ecumenical event for Juneteenth yesterday at a historically Black church, it feels weird, right? Like, I don't call down ill will upon my fellow human beings for practicing a religion that is not my own. If you look at the verses, though, especially the ones from Psalms, which is 3 out of the 5, what we're really talking about is when the armies of the non-Jews are arrayed against the Jews and we go to war, the Lord is king forever and ever, the nations are perished out of his land. We're talking about when the Jews, we're implying that when the Jews are at war with the non-Jews. That being said, the fact that we're permitted to say lines invoking ill will upon non-Jews does not necessarily mean that that feels good or that we ought to do that. All right, any questions, comments, or thoughts theologically? Go ahead, Judy. Rav Judy. Unmute also.
That's very nice when you're living in the United States. And, at this point, at least, it's okay for the Jews to be here. That may change as the numbers of people who become fascists in this country. And actually, I'd be happy to say a prayer against the poor boys and those other
Proud Boys.
groups, Proud Boys, whatever the hell they are. And those. So that's really, as I said, it's really fine if you're living in a society that accepts you and where you can thrive, which is true now, but we don't really know going forward if that's going to be true.
Right.
And I'm not a pessimist. So, and coming from a family of survivors, an uncle who was in Siberia and several aunts who survived Auschwitz, frankly, I don't have a problem with it.
Right.
It depends on which goyim we're talking about.
And we say this every day, right? It's hard to get away. Right. And I think this topic brings up a theological issue with Jewish prayer that we come to every day, which is in somewhere around blessing 9, 10, 11, we say, Val malshinin al tiye tikva, right? And to those evildoers, slanderer, non-Jew, apostate, zealots, there should be no hope, right? And you can interpret there should be no hope in many ways. If you're somewhat of a pacifist, you would say, may their designs be, brought to naught. But another person might say, may they be brought to nothing, To Judy's point, it's an interesting reflection, because I think there's a pretty strong split in the Jewish world theologically about whether violence against those who are wicked and evil and wish us physical harm is appropriate, or whether conversation and the changing of heart is appropriate, right? Books or bullets is a way that I sometimes frame it, right? A revolution can take you. It's hard to kill an idea, but if you kill all the people with that idea, you may at least stave off the violence. And that works in both directions, right? Left against leftists and rightists. I think about books and bullets in the context of kind of like communist revolutionaries in South America. Edward Pinochet wanted to eliminate all the people who were against him, who were intellectuals. So did Pol Pot in Cambodia. But it was hard because you can't kill an idea. So turning the hearts of fascists might, to me, be more effective. Now, I'm not going to debate that point with Judy, because I think we both have legitimate points. The bigger question, though, becomes, what should we be talking about at Rosh Hashanah? And is this one of the topics that we should be bringing up? Because if you can talk about anything in Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, right? And you could select 10 verses that dealt with the suffering and punishment of non-Jews who inflict maliciousness towards the Jewish people. Is that a thing that will magnify and elevate us at the high holidays? If we only did it in 3 of the 10 verses, what would that accomplish? If we only did it once, what would that accomplish? What are the themes you want to hear at Rosh Hashanah? And how much in the modern era should Judaism mess with stuff? I mean, I'll give you a parallel that's not to Rosh Hashanah, but is to the Haggadah, right? There's a thing that if you're the kind of family where you forget to do the rest of the Haggadah after Shulchan Orech, like my family did, you would have never heard of. But if you're a good, observant, conservative Jew, you've done every year, which is Shvoch Chamatcha al Hagoyim, right? there's this line in the Haggadah where it says, pour out your wrath upon the nations. And it was certainly kind of created, to Judy's point, to Rav Judy's point, in response to all of the times in the history in the Jewish people where we were oppressed and we suffered and we had a terrible lot. But, you know, in America today, do we want to pour out our wrath among the nations, on the goyim, right? Or should we, you know, do what some Haggadahs have done, the Noam Sion one that I use, changed it to pour out your love among the nations, right? Because we can simultaneously remember. So I was having this fight on Twitter, and then Marion, you can, I want to hear what you have to say. The Poles in my grandmother's village took up arms and exterminated every Jew in the village except her and her sister. Simultaneously, a Pole who worked at City Hall wrote my grandmother and her sister fake papers and a fake name and fake identity. And she went off to Germany and then served as slave labor for the Germans, only because they thought she was a Pole, and because she had fake papers. So Poles murdered my family and Poles saved my family, right? So Shvoch Hamarcha Al Goyim and Shvoch Ahava Al Goyim works simultaneously for me. And it depends how I'm feeling any given day. All right, Marion, go ahead.
No, I was just going to bring out that point about the Haggadah and the alternate saying to pour out your wrath with pour out your love. But I was also thinking, you can't do that, you know, talk to everybody. In our neck of the woods, there are certain nations, certain leaders that talking will absolutely do no good whatsoever.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. And that's been a difficult fight for the left and the right in the middle, you know, around the world regarding Israel, that like, you have to be educated to know that like Israel's reached out to Hezbollah and Hamas to figure out if there could be an agreement. And Hezbollah and Hamas's response was effectively, we'd like you all to pack up and move back to Europe. And the answer was, we didn't leave Europe because we were really excited to come to Israel necessarily. We had no place else to go. And it's our ancestral homeland, which we were thrown out of 2,000 years ago. But let's not get into politics. But you know, you are right, Marion. There are people you cannot reason with. The question then becomes, do you wish violence upon them, or do you wish a change of heart for them? And is the wishing and the praying for a change of heart wasted breath also? Are there people who you cannot reach? I am forever an optimist, and I'll talk to anybody. But it's hard. It's really, really hard. You know, I'm not going to pretend like that time that I saw two dudes with swastikas tattooed on their arms in the line to get on the plane in Denver. I didn't just flip out the whole time, and my blood just boiled the whole time. And I thought, you know, like, you know, I mean, you face it in Israel and we face it here in a different way. And it's ugly, but how do you square it? And then what do you pray about it? Any other comments before we move forward?
I would like to say something.
Sure.
I'm thinking about the Serenity Prayer, and that is associated with Alcoholics Anonymous, which I think maybe fits in this kind of situation too, in many situations, which reads something like, may I be granted the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Right.
So just wanted to share that.
It's great. And I think the interesting thing about this verse in the Talmud is it doesn't give us the wisdom. It does not give us the wisdom to discern the difference. And I think one of the challenges for medieval Jews, Gaonic Jews, and rabbinic era Jews was a sense theologically that, you know, war between Jews and non-Jews was somewhat inevitable. And their theology, the rabbinic theology was, Sidel, you weren't here for a couple classes, but I think we mentioned this at some point. Classic rabbinic theology and classic kind of prophetic theology is that the nations do not have independent kind of free will. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians are not like making war on Israel because they're out for land or power. They are the righteous fist of God who is punishing the Jewish people for our own moral iniquities as a nation, right? The prophetic word is all about when we mistreat the poor, the needy, the orphan, and the widow, then us as a nation get a can of whoop ass opened up against us by the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians. That theology makes a lot of sense back in the day, but today we don't like to think of those peoples as without free will, with as puppets in the hands of an angry God. So then we have to figure out, like, what does God want of us in conversation with those who are wicked, immoral, wrong, right? Like, my job as a rabbi is to bring those people around, is like to turn them around, I think. That being said, I'm not taking any press junkets to have an all expenses paid conversation with Hamas. It's like, it's not, I don't think they want to listen to me, Anyways, all right, let's move on. Cheryl Friedman, do you mind reading for us line 4 in English? You're good? Okay, I will read the Hebrew. Ein mazkirin zichron shel yechid, va'afilu latuva, kigon, zachreni Adonai birtzon amecha, ukigon, zachara li Elohai letova. All right, Cheryl, unmute.
I'm sorry, I was coughing, so I muted myself. The Gemara states one does not recite a verse dealing with remembering an individual, even if it is for good. For example, remember me, O Lord, when you show favor to your people. And for example, remember me, my God, for good.
Excellent. So this is a nice one and a clean one and a big flip. And it helps us theologically kind of moving along, which is the prayers of Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot are meant to be communal. We ask for blessing from God as a nation. We don't ask for individual blessing at this point, which is interesting. Because this parallels, right, the Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Dibarnu, Dofi prayers that we also say at the high holidays. And it also mirrors Al Chet Shechatanu Lefanecha, right? Like, on the sin that we have sinned. Prayer at the high holidays is kind of reckoned communally, which is interesting because the individual prayers of the Amidah typically are both kind of communal and individual. So we are not supposed to ask for our own blessing. And maybe it's just in the verses for Torah and Tanakh here, because the verses of Torah and Tanakh seem to have a little bit more force majeure. They seem to have more power, I think. And I think that's why the rabbis are belaboring this section so much. They really think that invoking specific verses of the Tanakh in the Amidah has a lot more weight. The prayers that we typically do allude to verses in the Tanakh, but they were written by the rabbis in the era right before the Talmud. And so they are not verses per se. Whether that gives them more power or less power, I don't know. I would think that the implication that we've learned here so far is that the verses have more power, right? Any other thoughts about this idea of individual prayer versus communal prayer? Cool. Oh, go ahead, Rav Judy.
Just that one of the things that our holy books try to do is give us agency. In other words, if we're bad, we will be punished and God will use whatever means God wants to. So we have control over the situation. Now, we know rationally in 2022 that that's not true. That when we're outpowered, when the hate grows and they want to kill us, it's not necessarily because we've been bad and not followed the Torah. We know that. So that's one of the things, and it's a positive thing to make us feel as Jews that we control the situation, that we have agency, but we know that's not true historically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Am I making sense?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking the biggest question about prayer, which is what is prayer? Like, what does it do?
Right.
A thing that I've said to teenagers, and it took me, by the way, I don't think I kind of came around to a more nuanced understanding of what prayer is until I had already become a rabbi. Like it took a while to figure out, like, what are we doing? Because the classic understanding of prayer is I am talking to God, right? Right now, I am sending a verbal request to the Holy One, blessed be, and the Holy One, blessed be, is listening, right? That's the classic understanding, okay? There are a couple other understandings that I like, right? Another understanding is I am sending a letter to God, right? It is an act of kind of verbal writing, which means that the divine receives it not at the moment that I say it, for one, and two, that the divine may not choose to open the letter, right? I don't know about y'all, or yins, but when I get my mail, I go through it and I go, all right, this is my retirement account. I'm curious to see how I'm doing. These 4 are credit card applications. I can throw them right in the trash, right? And this is the announcement of specials at Giant Eagle, right? That's going right in the garbage, right? And every 4 to 6 weeks I get a check, and then I go, woo, right? We're gonna open that one right away, right? The Holy One, blessed be, may be in the same situation with our prayers. And Baruch Hashem, our prayers are all a check, right? But maybe they're the announcement that pork roast is on sale at Giant Eagle, which goes right in the trash for me. Like, I don't need to know how much pork roast is going for these days because I ain't buying it. But so that's 2 versions of prayer. And a third one is that prayer is a conversation with ourselves, right? That prayer is, to quote Austin Powers, my own internal monologue. And that you are speaking to yourself to move yourself, right? So for me, I think of that a lot of the time. And I sometimes am scanning the words of prayer to say, what's the message I need today to get through? Yesterday was a funky day for me. So I'm having like a weird kind of like emotional hangover from yesterday. And I was kind of feeling a little low this morning, and my second cup of coffee just hadn't quite boosted me. And so prayer instead needs to kind of move me, and I need to zoom in on it to figure out, like, all right, what's in here that's going to kind of move my heart into the place that it needs to be today. By the way, study does the same thing. Talmud is the process of reading text and pulling out of it, what do I need from today? Remember me, my God, for good is a good lesson to read in the day. It's even better to think about how thinking about my own personal selfish needs can be elevated and magnified if I instead say, how can I reflect this text to be for everyone's collective good instead of my own good, right? Maybe my message for today is whatever happened to me yesterday that made me grumpy today, get out of your own head, Rabbi. Stop thinking about yourself. It's got to be about more than that. Sidel, go ahead.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. I just was thinking about the aspect of the community when it comes for prayer. So the power of that just seems to be important. So here we are, Rosh Hashanah, this collective. And so one other aspect that I just would put into the pot, which was just touched upon, is the power of the community standing by, just that alone. So aside from the letter to God, that's the individual letter, the individual conversation, but those folks all gathered round, that I'm just speaking about what that represents.
Yeah, I understand. I think, right. So another way of looking at prayer, it's a fourth way, Sidel, which is a fourth way of looking at prayer is to think to yourself, this is not a letter or a phone call or a conversation, a monologue, a one-person show that a person is reciting into the mirror in one's bathroom, right? But rather it's a choir, and we are singing together, and some pieces are the harmony and some pieces are the melody, and it all comes together to make the message that goes out, right? And that prayer in community is singing together, is we are accomplishing that message together. Go ahead.
And also just, I'm thinking about the support. So the person who's standing there and it's the yard site and they're standing up, and others realize, oh, okay, they're acknowledging the death of someone who's important to them. I just feel that that's a statement alone. That's very powerful.
Yeah. Being present is valuable too, whether you're singing in the choir or not. Yeah, very nice. All right, let's keep going. Let's see. Sidel, you're actually the next person open to talk, so to read. So go ahead and unmute yourself again. Pikdonot, hare hen kazichronot, kigon, varnai pakad et sarah, ukigon, pakad pakadati etchem, divrei Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, einan kazichronot.
Verses that mention God's revisitings, pikdonot, are equivalent to verses of remembrances, zikronot, and therefore they may be counted in the 10 verses. For example, and the Lord revisited Pakad Sarah, Genesis 21, verse 1. And for example, I have surely revisited Pakad Deti, you, from Exodus 3, verse 16. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yehuda says they are not equivalent to verses of remembrances.
Nice. Okay. This allows me to also teach a little bit on a specific conservative reform piece of disagreement. So great point. The question is fundamentally asked, when it says zichron, do we have to use a verse that says zichron, or can we go off script a little bit and take license? And can we use the word pakad? Now, the word pakad is weird. I've never liked it because it doesn't translate neatly. Now I really want to grab a Brown Driver Briggs and figure out what it says, but I'll hold off on nerding out a little bit. Pakad, I've always learned it as makes mention of, kind of like, or takes note of. Here, Steinsaltz is translating it as revisits. But the other way that I've heard it is remembers, right? I believe in our prayer book, it's translated as remembers. So the statement is made by Rabbi Yossi, the very same Rabbi Yossi from our Haggadah that in the most of our Haggadot from the 1950s is written Jose, and therefore your Uncle Sal always says it's Rabbi Jose. Hey, bring the beans and the burritos to the Passover Seder. Right now it's Rabbi Yossi, and they just took the J and made it as a Y. So Rabbi Yossi says pakad is okay to use. Any verse that has pakad in it can be used for zichron. The interesting thing here is that this verse, and the Lord revisited Sarah, pakad et Sarah, is the verse that the conservative movement used in 1987. A rabbi in Los Angeles decided, based simultaneously with the Reform movement, to include the Imahot in the Amidah prayer, right? So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu v'imotenu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Tzara, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak v'Elokei Yaakov, Elokei Sarah, Elokei Rivka, Elokei Rachel v'Elokei Leah. That got added to the conservative prayer book by a tshuva between the law committee by Joel Rembam in 1987. The Reform movement had made the same decision earlier, a couple years earlier. I think they included the Imahot in like 80, 81, 84, somewhere in there. And the Reform movement decided that the final line, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham, Ve'ezrat Sarah. And Ve'ezrat Sarah translates as, and Magen, shield of Abraham, Ve'ezrat, and aid to, or helper of Sarah. Now, I remember learning from Rabbi Rembam that he had real objection to that, because if you go through, if you went to Sefaria into this little search window over here, and you clicked on Ezrat Sarah or Azar Sarah or Ozer Sarah, you would not find it. There is no scriptural basis in Tanakh for God as helper of Sarah, or God or any concept of. I see you, Noreen. Let me finish and then you'll go. Don't steal my thunder, girlfriend. I'm pontificating about women's rights. How dare you, female, try to interrupt this white male? No. All right. I got to be self-aware once in a while. I'll finish the sentence and then you'll go, Noreen. The conservative movement and Rabbi Joel Rembam decided that the phrase that should be included is Pakad et Sarah. And this verse, Genesis 21, is the basis for why we say Pakad et Sarah. Now, you'll note from what Rabbi Yehuda says at the end, you can't say Pakad in Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofar, in Zichronot specifically, and have it count. Go ahead, Noreen.
I don't understand how we come to say that Pakad and Pikdonot is visiting when it actually means command, to command and order, or a deposit, a pledge. Nowhere do we ever use this word Pakad or Lifkod as visiting.
Right. So we're understanding it based on so the translation that you're giving us is based on modern Hebrew, and every Israeli knows that if you want to drop off your bottles at the store after they're done, or your cans or whatever, you get a picadon, right? Like you get a what? How did you translate picadon? A remittance, a deposit. That was the word. You're getting your deposit back. If I'm not mistaken, the word evolves through time. I would need to look up from the academia why they decided that the modern Hebrew translation is deposit or remittance or refund. Specifically in Genesis 21, that idea wouldn't work, right? And God deposited Sarah isn't what happens there, because it's the section where God basically remembers Sarah, because it's in Genesis 21, it's a spot where God gives Sarah, at the age of 99, allows her to become pregnant again, despite, being barren and infertile for her entire life. So most of the translations there are visited, revisited, remembered, or remembered for good is another one that I've heard. When class is over, I'll go and run and grab my BDB and see what Brown Driver Briggs says. I would guess that, if I'm not mistaken, this word is one that is hotly debated. Someone wanted to say something? Oh, Olivia's here. Yeah, Olivia, go ahead.
Hey, I linked a direct link to the page in the chat if you want to open it up while you're still on screen share.
Cool. Oh, there's a BDB online. I had no idea. All right.
There's a few.
What happens when I click that? Bad things. Nothing happens for me. I get a broken link.
Oh, well, over on the side, if you click that hamburger button.
Yeah, hang on.
Left.
I gotta undo the the thing. And then you gotta, all right. If you
Oh,
click
well,
the, all
whatever.
right, what do I click?
No, go back to the link that I linked you to.
Okay.
And then in the upper left corner, the like under your back arrow, where your back arrow is gray,
Yeah.
is like a 3-line button. It's called like a hamburger button. This looks like a hamburger. 3 lines.
You may have to move the page over to see it.
I don't. Yeah, you were almost right on it.
This?
No, it's on the same line as the word Hebrew,
This?
right
Oh.
above it.
This?
Yes.
There you go.
Oh. I never knew that it's called a
Word.
hamburger button.
Yeah, 3 lines. You know, it's like a hamburger.
Clever. All right.
All right, maybe this website doesn't work on your browser. I'll try
Could
to
be.
find another one.
No, don't worry about it. I mean, we can pull it up at the end. So, but thank you for trying. I appreciate it. But you can also read it to me if you can tell me what it says.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So attend to, visit, muster, appoint. And then he gives some like more etymology of it, of visit or enjoin, attend to, provide, give heed or attention. And then we also have command in that time as well.
Mm-hmm.
You're right, it does not translate cleanly because it has so
Yeah.
many meanings that we don't connect in English.
Right. And to Noreen's point, none of those get in the direction of why is this word the word for a deposit in modern Hebrew?
Oh,
And
that one does have a little bit of basis.
Okay.
Also, it's a
Later
clerk.
in the entry.
Uh-huh.
There's one meaning that's lay upon as a charge. And by Ezra, there's an instance where it's a deposit.
Okay. That's interesting.
From
Yeah.
like appointing.
Well, also part of that definition also fits a clerk that is also a poked in modern Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I have the dictionary that I have at hand in my small dictionary is Jastro. So Jastro is interested only in the rabbinic understanding. So it's going to translate according to the Talmud, and it has search, examine, visit, have marital connection with, remember, decree upon, count, muster, entrust, give charge, deposit, command, order. And then and that's all in Pa'al. And if we were to switch it up to PL, Nifal, or Hifal, it would have other meanings. But it can also be to command as a completely separate word, meaning something else. And however, in Pikadon, the translation is thing given in charge, comma, deposit. So it seems like one of the dominant understandings of it, the way the modern Israeli lexicon understands this word. By the way, if you are bored out of your skull with our hardcore dictionary nerding out, I apologize. But I think that this is a worthwhile rabbit hole to go down every once in a while. Is to pakad is something that you command, and a pikadon is something that you have been given command of and are returning. So basically, the understanding of pakad is, by the way, Elisheva, maybe I'm stealing your thunder because I feel like I'm anticipating what you're about to say. When you're in the Israeli army and someone says, run, the response to your commanding officer is ken mefaked, which means, right? Yes, sir, right? So your mefaked is your commander, your peak and pakad is the root of that. And so a pikadon is that which was given in charge of. Okay, Elisheva, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's kind of, I've been doing a little looking and there's nothing that supports what I've been taught except very around the edges. I was always taught that it meant to take account of, and that in modern Hebrew, not that it's part of my regular vocabulary, that it had to do with accounting and activities of that sort, so that
Yeah.
it was more about paying attention to, considering what her side of things was, to take account of Sarah. And that's always when we say Ufoket Sarah, which we don't in our Kihila. I always do, but we don't. It's not in our prayer book. That's the sense I have of it, that God is paying attention, taking account of Sarah's interests in this whole negotiation.
Yeah, I have definitely heard the word. So the first one I gave was visit, and I've definitely heard Pakadet Sarah as God was visiting Sarah, and that's why she became pregnant. That God kind of, helped her with her.
That's a little raunchy.
No, not like that. Not like that. This is not the virgin birth. That's a different religion. So, I just want to make one more uber grammatical nerdy comment, which is because it's out of confusion. The Jastrow understanding of two of the major differences between command and to visit is a slight difference in the way the word is broken down. And one is pakad with a kamatz, which is the little T symbol underneath the pay. And the other one is pakad with a seire underneath. So, and that is really confusing, right? Like that is really, I took advanced grammar in fourth year of rabbinical school, or sorry, second year of rabbinical school, advanced Hebrew grammar, and all that stuff just went whoop right out my ear because it was too, so I can't tell you how that breaks down. But by the way, neither can Jastrow, because Jastrow includes the idea of to command an order under pakad and also to command under pukad. And at the end of the day, the answer here is also like, we don't know, because ancient Hebrew is not as clean and neat as Eliezer ben Yehuda would like it to be. Renee, go ahead, and then we'll move forward. We've been stuck on this for a while.
One of the things you mentioned at the very end was to deposit and then give back. And it sort of reminds me of the whole idea of Sarah, who asked to be pregnant if she had a child, to give the child to God in the service of God. And so I don't know if that's where that connects, but at the very end of your definition, you mentioned to deposit and then give back.
Yeah. The thing that you said, I don't associate with Sarah. Not that it's wrong. It might be a nice commentary that someone brought. I associate it more with Samson. Samson's really famous for being a Nazir, right? He never cut his hair and he never drank alcohol. And the reason was his mother had a difficulty conceiving and prayed to God and said, I will pledge my child as a Nazir if you make me pregnant. And that's why she became pregnant. And then, he got super strength and yada, yada, yada. So
the same thing with Hannah and Shmuel and Shaul.
Yeah.
Because he was promised to God if she became pregnant.
Right. Right. And I think it all fits in with this idea of God remembering these women. And I'm not sure if the word pakad is used in those two stories either. That would be a good thing to Google or search, which is the kind of thing that I bet you Olivia is doing right now. Okay, let's keep moving before we get trapped in Tanakh. The joke in rabbinical school that I probably told you all before, because I have no original stories, is conservative rabbis learn Tanakh by studying Talmud, right? Like I don't know the story of Samuel that well, except in rabbinical school, I was forced to learn it because it would pop up in a Talmudic story and I'd have to learn it. So, okay, onward.
There's, by the way, a solid page of citations in BDB.
Yeah, it's Akkad is a hot mess. That's if you were clicking forward and advancing through this section in our YouTube, Akkad is a hot mess. That's all you need to know. That's the short of it. Elisheva, you're going to read the English for us. Rabbi Yossi nahi nami de pikdonot hare hen kezichronot. Varonai pakad et Sarah, pikadon de yechid hu, kevan de atu rabim mina, karabim damya.
The Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, although verses that speak of God revisiting man are equivalent to verses of remembrances, he cites the following verse as an example. And the Lord revisited Sarah, which is a revisiting of an individual. Despite the fact that it was stated above that a remembrance must refer to the collective, since many descendants come from her, as Sarah is the mother of the Jewish people, she is considered like many. Therefore, this verse is effectively dealing with the remembrance of the entire Jewish people.
Yeah. So this is a nice kind of
Very
like,
cute.
yeah, it's a nice clarification and connection with our previous idea, which is, all right, well, we can't individualize the prayers of the Musaf Amidah, right? It's supposed to refer to the collective and the community of the Jewish people. Aha! But Sarah's one person, so we're remembering one individual. However, if we think about it the other way, Sarah is the progenitor mother of the entire Jewish people, and therefore we're not really talking about her, we're talking about all of us. It's a little bit of a weak Talmudic straw man, but is a classic straw man in the sense that it's a weak idea that helps us in the debate to clarify the ultimate vision. So you can mention one individual, but that individual has to be representative of the collective. And I think that also is a nice theological idea that when we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel in our prayers, we're thinking about us. We're not necessarily thinking about them from that time period. We're thinking about what they did for us moving forward. All right, we're going to do 7 just so that we can say we did it. Be puzzled by it. Sit in stupefaction for an entire week. Stupefaction, another good Scrabble word. And then, no. How dare you, Marion? How dare you? By the way, I'm terrible at Scrabble. You'll all kick my butt. Renee, if you don't mind, I'm going to have you read the English. And for a lot of us, this will be a really familiar section. And by the way, it's kind of a flight of fancy. The rabbis are riffing and going off. Seu sha'arim rashechem vehisu pichei olam v'yavo melech hakavod mizo melech hakavod Adonai izuz v'gibor Adonai gibor milchama seu sha'arim rashechem usu pichei olam v'yavo melech hakavod mizo melech hakavod Adonai tzvot hu melech hakavod Selah Rishona Shtaim Shnaim Shalosh Divrei Rabbi Yossi.
The Gemara discusses several verses from Psalms. Lift up your heads, O you gates, and be lifted up, you everlasting doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. The psalm continues, lift up your heads, O you gates, and lift them up, you everlasting doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who then is the King of glory? The King of hosts. He is the King of glory, Selah. The first section is counted as 2 verses of kingship, as the term king is mentioned twice, while the second section is counted as 3 verses of kingship. This is the statement of Rabbi Yossi.
Okay, so we need a very basic, at this point, very tachlis, very purpose-driven primer as to if I wanted to put verses into the Musaf Amidah for Malchuyot, how would I do it, right? Is Seu Sha'arim Roshechem Vesu Pichei Olam Miuza Melech HaKavod, is this one section of 4 lines, 7, 8, 9, and 10, since it mentions the word Melech, is this one Malchuyot? Or since the word Melech shows up 5 times, can I get 5 verses out of this? Can I count this as a 5 spot, right? Or can I count it as a 4 spot since it's 4 lines? Or are the lines arbitrary since, by the way, and this makes a lot of sense, the Masoretes who punctuated the Torah don't come around till the 5th century of the Common Era. and are a group that exists until the 10th century of the Common Era, right? Punctuation was not a thing in the Torah. So we couldn't really say a pasuk was a pasuk until much after the rabbis. The rabbis arbitrarily decided what a pasuk was. So
But there was ta'amim before that, and ta'amim is punctuation.
Yeah.
Interesting. When did the ta'amim get laid down?
I think the Masorites only recorded what the ta'amim were. They didn't invent it.
We'll have to figure out when the
I mean, usually things that are passed down orally come with a chant, a melody. I suspect ta'amim is very, very old.
Right. I can believe that. I can believe that. But whether they were authoritative is a good question, or whether there were minhagim and different opinions about where the verse ended and so on is another matter. But that's a different debate for someone with a PhD, which I am not. Okay, so last point is just like, how do we count it and how do we do it? And so the rabbis are finally getting into tachlis, like how do we actually go about starting to do this? However, and we're going to leave on a Batman style cliffhanger, dun dun dun, we end with the phrase, this is the statement of Rabbi Yossi. For those of you who've been coming to this class many times, you know that when we end with a statement of one rabbi, it's almost certainly going to begin the next line. And if you're cheating, you can see at the next line, it says Rabbi Yehuda Omer. The rabbis are going to disagree about how we count these verses. That's a good place to stop for today, since we're right at about an hour. Thanks for everyone to come to class, and we'll see you next week.